Hi, this is period 3, Taxation Without Representation, lesson number 3. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how British colonial policies regarding North America led to the Revolutionary War. So this is it. This is the time period where America becomes a hotbed of revolution. We're going to be talking about some of the events like the Boston Tea Party and the Stamp Act and the Sons of Liberty that I know you have learned about, but we are going to tie it all in to explain how colonial policies that the British put forward leads the colonies to the Revolutionary War. Our first key concept is this idea of the British trying to collect new taxes without direct colonial representation. So this is the idea of no taxation without representation. The act that got most Americans in the colonies excited, so to speak, was the Stamp Act. It was passed in 1765. It was necessary to pay for the cost of the 7 Years' War, which you learned about in the previous lesson. And Parliament passed this Stamp Act, which required all legal documents, wills, newspapers, playing cards, commercial documents, dice even, they had to be taxed and they had to have a royal stamp. It was like an ink stamp. This impacted lawyers, newspaper publishers, businessmen, and the cost was then passed on to virtually everyone, anybody that dealt with paper. Even if you went to a tavern and you used a deck of cards, the cards would cost more because the tavern owner had to pay for the stamp. So that's the impact, is that it was the first direct tax that impacted just about every single person. Moving on, colonial response to the Stamp Act. Needless to say, they were not happy. Colonial governments formed committees of correspondence. This is exactly what it sounds like. They were committees, groups of people located throughout the 13 colonial regions to correspond, to communicate. They coordinated the opposition to this tax, and it actually leads to the very first assembly of colonial leaders, which is called the Stamp Act Congress. So the committees of correspondence linked all 13 colonies, and the Stamp Act Congress got colonial leaders together to discuss opposition. So what they did was they sent over a list of grievances. That was part of their protest. Here's why we don't like it. They held boycotts of imperial British goods that were imported, such as tea, paper. They had protests in the streets. And believe it or not, the protests and the boycotts were successful. It leads to the repeal. The Stamp Act was only in effect for about a year or so, and the British Parliament got rid of it. However, it left a bad taste in the mouths of the colonists. They were angry. They were frustrated. They felt that they did not have a say in this taxation at all. So if there's any single tax of all of the taxes that were passed, and there were many, the one that you need to remember is the Stamp Act, because it leads to the committees of correspondence, because it leads to the Stamp Act Congress, and it leads to the first organized boycotts. Moving on to our second key concept is really how the colonial leaders, they begin to formulate reasons for rebellion. Some of the reasons for rebellion is they have rights as British citizens, as Englishmen, and they feel that if you are an English citizen, you have the right to be taxed, but not without representation. So this right as an Englishman is important, that all English people have the same rights. Just because we live in Pennsylvania or Boston does not mean we don't have the same rights. This idea of the nature of the British government as well, they feel that they have colonial legislators. and legislatures that had been in place from the very beginning of the colonies. They felt that these colonial legislators and legislatures had the right to tax them. They were okay with paying the taxes that a local, like let's say the Virginia House of Burgesses, would pass in Virginia. They were okay paying those taxes. It was this idea that only a colonist would understand how much a colonist could afford to pay because they'd be paying the same tax themselves. They felt that someone across the pond, thousands of miles away, could not share in their experience and therefore had no idea what would be a fair tax. There is also this idea of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is this explosion of ideology about natural rights and about the best method of governing. And at the very same time, the Stamp Act is passed and the colonists are expected to pay it. The colonists are deep into Enlightenment thinking. Many of the elites had read all of the Enlightenment works, such as John Locke, etc. And it caused the colonists to challenge this idea that this tax is a violation of their natural rights to pursue property. It also caused them to question whether the social contract, which created the British government and the colonists that keep them together in this contract, needs to be broken and replaced. So they began to question the very foundations of government. So it's all about time and place. While the Enlightenment was going on, the 7 Years' War happened, hence they had to pass the tax, which they felt they had to pass at the British Parliament to urge the colonists to pay, thus leading to increased colonial opposition to the tax. Moving on to our next key concept is, again, all about time and place. Key leaders step up to lead the colonists in this idea of independence. They emerge from all classes. They emerge from all colonies or colonial regions, I should say. By far, the most well-known and the most storied is none other than Benjamin Franklin himself. He was a newspaper publisher who lived in Philadelphia. He opposed the Stamp Act and he began publishing articles and pamphlets which bring Enlightenment ideas of natural rights and the social contract throughout the colonists. These were read especially by middle-class merchants and the wealthy businessmen. Benjamin Franklin was quite well known and had quite a good reputation. So people listened to him and they believed what his newspaper put forward. Another leader, a little bit more radical, who lived up in Boston, was a cousin of John Adams, who becomes the second president. His name is Samuel Adams. He wanted more direct action. He didn't want to just write about it and let people read. He wanted to organize. He wanted to protest, and to organize and protest he does. He begins organizing working class, dock workers, as well as women to protest and oppose the British government and to force the British government to make changes. Samuel Adams was instrumental in creating the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty was organized as a radical group of colonists who used protest, violence, sabotage to undermine British rule. One example that you've all heard about is the Boston Tea Party, where they took hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money of tea in protest, which was someone else's property, and they dumped it into the Boston Harbor. They also attacked British tax collectors, including one notorious incident of tarring and feathering. This then leads to bloodshed known as the Boston Massacre. So there's all kinds of protests and movements, and much of this was led by the Sons of Liberty. The women's group that organized is known as the Daughters of Liberty. They were a loosely organized group of women who used their power to help organize boycotts of British goods. The women held the purchasing power, and they were the ones that began to home make all of their everyday items. So the Daughters of Liberty is also quite influential. Our final key concept is to explain how men and women mobilize in large numbers. There are the Patriots and the Loyalists. The Patriots were all over the colonies, but they were strongest in New England and Pennsylvania, especially among those radical groups known as the Sons of Liberty. The Patriots were the ones who began to organize local militias who were supposed to have a weapon and be ready on a moment's notice to fight or be ready for the influx of British soldiers. There are more and more British soldiers coming to the Americas in order to help keep control and enforce the law in the colonies. These are the Minutemen that you've heard about, that are sang about in songs and written about in poems. The next group are the Loyalists. These colonists opposed the ideas of independence and they wanted to maintain the status quo with the British. They were found predominantly among the elite who had business ties and family ties to the British. They were, again, all throughout the colonies, but they were strongest in the southern colonies, such as Charlestown, South Carolina, and the British West Indies. About 1/3 were Patriots, 1/3 were Loyalists, and about 1/3 were completely undecided. They really just didn't know if they supported the Loyalist or the Patriot cause, but that begins to shift toward the Patriot side once the actual fighting begins. And what begins to happen? The fighting does begin when the British decide they are going to seize weapons and supplies from towns outside of Boston. This prompts the Minutemen to organize. And the organization is led by the Sons of Liberty, and they send riders, Paul Revere, Samuel Prescott, and another rider, William Dawes, to ride and warn the colonists of that midnight ride, which leads to the very first shots fired of the Revolutionary War. The shot heard round the world was on April 19th, 1775, thus beginning the War for Independence. Once the shots rang out, the colonists decide they are going to call for a second Continental Congress. The Continental Congress is going to serve as a wartime government, and they are going to try to negotiate with the British. They are expecting delegates. Each colony is sending delegates, and their goal of the Second Continental Congress is to compromise. However, the Patriot cause eventually wins out and becomes the majority because the British refuse to compromise. That concludes our lesson, which I hope by now you are able to explain how British colonial policies regarding North America leads to the very first shots fired of the War for Independence.